So in this session, we're going to talk about SQL Server data tools and how we can use that tool to get a handle on database evolution as part of product development. My name is Sergey Barsky. I work for Tyler Technologies out of their Atlanta office. We're not a consultant company, but if you email me, and I have my email address at the last slide, I will reply to any questions you might have after the session. I started using SSDT maybe about a year and a half ago when it shipped. And comparing to other tools, I found that it does a very good job to solve some of these common database development problems. So when it comes to databases, historically, you had a couple of issues. As your software evolves, database has to evolve with the actual software. You have to typically synchronize it, which means you have to evolve the schema somehow. One of those problems would be to put your schema and really data as well under some kind of a source control solution. And comparing to other company, Microsoft created a product that helps you put schema under source control when they shipped DataDude, which shipped with Studio 2008 as a separate product called Visual Studio for Database Professionals or some other really long marketing name like that. So that was their first attempt, because other companies already had or were about to release similar products such as Redgate. And I actually used DataDude for about 18 months, and I found the idea was really good, but the implementation was really subpar. And so it was really irritating to use this product, in my opinion. And one of those big problems was the fact that DataDude forced you to split your tables into multiple files, where fields go into one file and indexes into another file, foreign keys into a third one, and so forth and so on. And you had one table, you have to check in 12 different things. That was really not a good flow. So they realized it, but they in Microsoft, they realized the shortcomings of that product, and SSDT was an evolution of DataDude. It retained some of the features like source control, but it also enhanced some other features such as deployment model. And DataDude did have a deployment model, but it seemed very cumbersome. And even the DBA that we had on our team when we used DataDude, she preferred to deploy using Redgate, not the DataDude, interestingly enough. So even though they DBA mandated using of DataDude, but she refused to use the tool, which is kind of telling as to what a cumbersome tool that really was. And deployment story improved quite a bit, and deployment is something you have to use when you evolve schema in production or in QA. And the simplified deployment model in SSDT, which is something we'll look at, really makes it uber easy to plug into either manual process, scripted process, or even into a build process. And you can deploy as part of TFS build, for example, or any other build framework that you might have. One thing I want to talk about is how Microsoft positions SSDT. So if you go read the documentation on the tool, the Microsoft positioning is that they want developers to be using SSDT and DBAs to use SSMS or SQL Server Management Studio. But what I found that SSDT is really useful for everybody. But in our shop, we really don't have a DBA per se, and all developers use SSDT. And once we switched to what we used to use, which was either DataDude or just a plain giant script file that everybody keeps appending to, they found that this product is really, really developer friendly. So to install it, the installation story is super simple. You run Microsoft Web Platform Installer and you search for SSDT and you just install the latest version. And that's really all there is to do for you to install it. So when it comes to usage, there are two primary modes of operation that SSDT has. And documentation calls them online and offline, but really offline means a project-based development. So when it comes to online development, it functions very similar to SSMS, or a SQL Server Management Studio. You have, for the most part, the same functions, though you don't have all the functionality that SSMS provides in SSDT. But you do have all the key things. So it allows you to edit most objects in your model, such as tables and store proc and indices, all that stuff you can do in SSDT. And this is really what DBAs use. But when it comes to development, much more interesting story is the project-based development. And that's how we use it. So we have a database project corresponding to a database. Developers alter what essentially is plain text files or scripts that are part of that project, and they just check in and check out their changes. And at the end, you can deploy the schema changes straight from the studio. So you can get latest of this project, which essentially is the schema broken down into the files, into SQL files. But when you build the project, it creates a deployment for you. And you can create a script that you can deploy, or you can create a deckpack file you can deploy, or you can deploy straight as part of the build. So there is some flexibility, but the project deployment is all about creating these artifacts in your source control, whichever source control you want to use, because they're plain text files. You can, for example, run a history or do a comparison, and it functions for the most part just like you would expect. So I have some more files, but I think it's just as easy to explain the online model through the Studio. So I'm going to switch to Studio. We're going to spend the rest of the time in code, and I'll jump at the end to slides just to make sure I didn't miss or forgot something. So after you install SSDT, if you want to use the online mode, you have to pull up SQL Server Object Explorer window, which is added by the installer. I'm going to pin it here for a minute. And this is very, very familiar UI if you ever used SSMS. So you can add a new server. I already added my local one. And inside there, I can see what I would expect to see. I see databases, I see tables. If I expand the tables, I see columns. So for the most part, your online model is really just like SSMS. But as far as developers are concerned, what it allows you to do is not to switch to another tool. So if you want to look at the data, you don't have to switch to SSMS. All you do is right-click and do new query, for example. And then I can simply write T-SQL just like I would in SSMS. But I do get, as you notice, immediately IntelliSense. And I can execute the query, and I can see the result. So the idea, and it corresponds to how Microsoft positions the tool, it keeps developers inside the studio for all the database work. So you stay in it, you can query the data, you can create the objects even. For example, I can edit a table if I wanted to. So if I double click on it, what comes up next is the designer. And this designer is very similar to the one that ships in SSMS, although functionality is somewhat reduced. So there are certain things you cannot do. But for developers, it does pretty much everything they want to do. So if I wanted to add another column, for example, there are a couple of ways I can do it. I could simply just type into the designer. I have the same kind of behavior where I can pick a type. I can say allow nulls or not. I can specify the default. One interesting thing you will notice here is that my window, script window, and a design window is immediately synchronized. So if you watch it, I change the type, you immediately see the change reflected in the script. So what you check into source control is this bottom window right here. So this portion goes into source control. When I double click on that file from source control, I get the same design outcome. So on the fly, the tool parses the script and creates a visual representation for you. So some developers like the designer, some like type in. The tool accommodates both of those ways to work with Schema. And so it's trying to stay flexible. There is also one more window that works with SSDT, and that's a property window. And again, it's exact same property window in Studio that you would use for everything else. But when I'm in the design mode and I click on a field, then the property of the field are displayed in my properties window. And now what you will notice that all three windows are going to be synchronized. So I made a change to allow nulls, and if you watch it, immediately my script and my design window immediately got synchronized. So this is the third way I could make changes. And for the most part, they all work. Certain things don't. Like if I add the foreign key, I can't edit foreign key in the properties window. This is probably something they will eventually add, but I could always write the code in the script if I wanted to. And what I'm saying by that, so if I add a foreign key, for example, and I look at the properties, it does show the same kind of window that I see in SSMS, but it is read-only. That leads us to another feature you will notice here. Some of my code now is underlined, and what it tells me is that I made a mistake. So what you see in here, which is what SSMS, for example, does not do, I have quote-unquote compile time check. In other words, I cannot even deploy that, and if I try to, it'll give me an error saying, you've created a problem. So compile time checking is one of those really, really cool features. So I'm going to delete that for a minute, but I could also type in and fix that problem. Now, I can save that script, or I can do live updates. Not something that you would recommend, but I could click on update, and then I have a few options. I could create a script and give it to DBA or somebody else, or I can just click update database, and it'll perform the live update for me. And the live update is reflected in my data tools operation window, which is another window that comes with SSDT. And anytime you deploy, you will see that specific task reflected in my data tools operation window. And what I can see there, I can click on view script and see the script that was run. And you can see here's the actual code, besides all other fluff, which is transactional support. So if I have a number of changes that are wrapped inside transaction, meaning if I hit an error, it'll roll everything back. But at the end, in the script, I see my change of adding a column to my table that I did. And if I have any errors, then the view result will also show me whatever errors occurred right here in the bottom of the screen. So right now, no errors. It just says update complete. If I had made any mistakes, it would have shown here in the message tab what mistakes I have made. So when it comes to working with live databases, this is really the story. And all other features that I'm going to show you still apply to online mode, but I'm going to switch and demonstrate all the rest of them as part of the project instead. But for the most part, whatever you're going to see from now on will still apply to online mode as well. So what I'm going to do is hide this and auto hide. So now I have some room here to work with. Now I have two choices. I need to create a project. So what I can do is go to File, New Project. I can also add it to a different solution. It works the same way. At the end, it's just a project. I'll find that project under other languages and SQL Server. There is only one option there, and that's the one I need to pick. SQL Server database project. And then what's going to happen is it's going to add a blank project for me. So at that point, I can simply right-click on it, say add new item. I have a pre-filtered list of items excuse me, that are specific to SQL Server, which is nice because I don't want to search for like C# stuff and forms and all that to find what I'm looking for. And if I want to look at something specific, there are subcategories there for me as well. And then I can, for example, add a table. And somewhere in here there's a table. Of course, if I don't remember, I can just search here. So I can add a table and click add, and it'll add a table to my project. So that's one way of doing it. In other words, this is the flow I would follow if I have a brand new database I'm designing. More common approach would be you bring in SSDT into an existing project. You can start a new one, obviously, but more commonly you would drag it into an existing one. And in that case, you have an import option. So if I want to import an existing database, I simply right-click. I can create new connection. I already created one. This new connection is your standard connection window, nothing fancy about that. And I'm going to bring in a database. And then I have a few extra options here under import settings. These are the defaults. I can specify what structure I like. That really depends on your personal preference. Really, the default is schema/object type. So if you're using single schema like a default DBO, you will see DBO, then tables, and then all the tables will be listed and so forth. So I'm going to leave it as that. If you like a flat structure, you can use none. Or if you want to group by object type that but schema, then use object type. Not really sure why this setting it here. I think it's kind of strange. So if you're working with a large database, 1,000 objects is not really that much. In a database we're working with, some of them have like 1,200 tables. So bringing those under the structure is not really going to work. What you will end up with is like folder called, I think they call it tables 1, and then tables 2, and they start splitting stuff. Fortunately, after all that is done, you can just highlight all the tables under certain things and just drag them into another folder. I'm not going to do that. So if you don't like what the import does, you can simply drag your objects afterwards and rearrange them however you like. So this brings my structure in. As you will notice, when I click on any table, I see exact same structure. Now I want to talk about source control. So the interesting part is that I would just say add solution to source control, and it will simply import this project with all the artifacts, adds them to source control just like any other file. And as I mentioned, when I double click on it, you see that it opens in a designer. But if I click on open with and just do text editor, what you will see, what goes into source control is the plain vanilla SQL file, albums.sql, that all it does, it has a script to create a table. So the designer digests all that and builds the UI for you. What's in source control is something that you can easily do comparison on. And if you want to see compare with previous version, you will actually see the differences in plain T-SQL. So all that basic functionality works just like you would expect. Now let's work with something else. Let's create a store procedure, for example. So I'm going to add new store procedure. As you see, some of the common types that you work with a lot, they are on a right click add, and I'm gonna call it select, I don't know, artist, I think. After what comes in, I can see that it's a basic, your pretty much basic structure of a store procedure. Then I can type select star from, and it's just gonna be DBO in my case, and artist. And I can do order by even. And it's gonna be artist ID or name, I think. So what you noticed again is the IntelliSense here works, which is kind of neat functionality. So if you use Redgate tools like SQL prompt, you probably are familiar with it. However, if you're not, having a nice IntelliSense is what speeds up your development process. So having that in itself is a big feature. If I want to misspell it, you also have, again, compile time checking that immediately tells you what's wrong with it. So to demonstrate what happens when I try to deploy with errors, let's talk about the deployment for a minute. So I'm going to right click, click publish. Immediately says, okay, you have an error, and then you cannot publish that. So I have to fix it first. Now if I click publish, what's going to happen here, I'm going to get a prompt for what's called a publish profile. So publish profile is essentially an XML file that contains some of the target database settings for the most part, plus some other settings that are core to the deployment and deployment of specific objects in your database. So what I'm going to do is create a profile here, and I'm going to give the server name. I'm going to keep the database as database 7, just as good. And then I can save this profile as database.publish.xml. So what you notice that this profile just got created. Again, if I double click on it, it opens up in tooling. And if I edit it, what you will notice that it's simply a connection string broken down into multiple properties, such as a database name and a target connection string and so forth. What that tells me is where I'm going to deploy it. What is interesting about it is that I can have multiple published profiles. So I can deploy the same project to different destinations. And in this case, I can say, I'm going to make a copy of this profile, and if I'm using Azure, for example, I can create a separate profile, edit the connection string, or the one for QA, for example. And what I can do is build these multiple profiles. I don't have to check them all into source control, however. So if you have a QA person who manages QA database, you can just put that profile somewhere else where developers cannot accidentally use it. And if you have one for production, you can check it in somewhere else as well. And for developers, they just need a local deployment. So to do that, if you have multiple ones, you can right click on it and set and check the option that says set as default publish profile. And what happens if you have multiples, when you click publish, it'll automatically pick up the one that's marked as default and pull it up. So now I have some options that I can look at. So if you're deploying to production and you do have a production DBA that wants to create a script and deploy it, inspect it, and deploy it by hand, you can always click on Generate Script button straight from here. What's going to happen is that tooling is going to compare the database that is on the server, that is part of my target connection string, with my project, and it's going to generate the script. So in my case, it includes everything, because I've never deployed to this, never deployed database 7 yet. So I'll go ahead and do that. So now if I looked at View and SQL Server Object Explorer, and I refresh my database, I should see database 7 with all the tables, and hopefully I have my store procedure here as well. So now, if I want to order it by artist ID, for example, and now I'm going to publish again, publish, and generate script this time, what you will notice that the script is much shorter. What happened now is that my project was compared to my structure, and SSDT determined that for the most part it all looks the same except this one store procedure. So that's all I'm going to say in my script. So as long as you have the project and you have, for example, database in QA, you can run this comparison, simply generate the script and hand it over. Or you can deploy it straight from here. So while we're on deployment, so if I'm going to switch to this folder here from the command line, cd, now I can use MS build, and this is what you would use if you're deploying from TFS build script. So if you have a continuous integration, for example, that deploys to QA or deploys to some server where you do integration testing, you can plug it into TFS proj file, TFS build.proj file, and all you have to do is create MS build task, but your targets are going to be different. So your targets are going to be, I'm going to use build, but I also need the one that's called SQL publish. So these targets, project file doesn't exist. Okay, I need to actually give it a project file. There we go, SQL proj. Target is going to be build, and then SQL publish. And this is exactly what you would put inside your TFS build proj file. So what it tells me right here is that I need to give it a profile. So if you remember that published profile that I had, that XML file, I need to add another parameter or a property, and I'm going to tell it SQL publish. Well, I don't want to type. So all I have to do is type SQL publish profile equal, give it a path to that SQL publish profile, and it'll go ahead and deploy all that. SQL, actually let's just do that. Publish profile path equal, here we go, this one. So if everything, it even echoed me to the screen. So it just did what it said, that it just altered procedure, select artist, and it deployed it. Now it should be sorted by ID. So if I want to confirm that, I can go here, script as, which is another functionality of online editing. I can right click and it'll generate the script for me. And as you can see, it deployed successfully my change. So MS build task is something that you could use as part of your integrated build process. This is one way you can deploy your changes. Now, what we can do as well is look at the properties of the project, and what you will see is some of the options that you have when it comes to deployment. Let's see if I find the right place. So these are some of the database settings. Those are not quite as interesting. And then I think it's under debug and advanced. Actually, let's stay here for a minute. So under debug, I have a default connection string that I'm going to use. And then I have some options. If I'm running, if I'm using SSDT for integration tests, like we do that. And what we do in those cases is always recreate database, because we have a known structure that we run for integration tests. So we drop, we recreate it, and we run our unit test on a known quantity, not unit test, but integration test on a known database. There are a couple of other options. This blocking data loss occur warning, this is the third one. What that means is if you had a column that was of size 50 characters, and now you're saying that we really don't have data that long, so I'm going to switch to 30. If you have that checked, then it won't deploy. It'll say you may potentially lose the data for that. So in those use cases, what you want to do is have maybe a specific profile that allows you to deploy with the incremental changes. So if I look at my published profile, pick any one of them, and I click on advanced, what you will see is the overrides for all the default settings that I showed you in the properties. In published profile, you have exact same set of settings. So you can say that within published profile, I do want to deploy even though my database field is shrunk, so I can potentially lose some data. So I can do that. So if I do click OK, save profile, and let me reopen it again in just source code editor. And right in here, another property got added, block and possible data loss. So you can build this published profile with exact settings that you want as you work with, and those will override the default. This is the one that is a very interesting one. It's the one we use. So if you want to make sure that your target database is always matching your project, this is the options you want to check. Drop objects in target but not in project. So what that means, if your DBA added an index to a table to make something faster in production and forget to tell you, if that option is checked, that the index will go away. So what that option teaches people is discipline. Because when that option is on, you cannot make a mistake, because it'll just revert whatever changes you do outside of SSDT. So on our team, we have that on. But I think it depends really on who you're working with and what your specific procedure is. But this really forces people to be very, very disciplined and make sure the changes only are made inside the source control, inside the project, not on the database itself. Because once you start losing your changes, you will figure very quickly that this is not the procedure we want to follow. And let's look at some of the advanced options. Some of the more common ones that we don't have checked is security, like logins and options. I don't see them now. But there is ignore user and ignore, there it is. So ignore login, SIDs, and ignore permissions. Some of those, if you have different permissions in production from the ones in QA, you probably have to check them because you don't want to wipe the security settings during the deployment. Okay, I don't even remember all of those properties. As you can see, there are like 4 pages of them. So you can look at them, and MSDN documentation is decent enough to explain what it is that each option does. But for the most part, they're kind of self-explanatory. Any questions so far? I'm going kind of quick. Question?
When you did the build from the offline one, not the TFS build, but the other build, it doesn't force you to check that in first, right? So you're building off your local code.
Correct. You always build in.
Check in, or don't ever check in, or undo check in.
Correct. So you do. Tools have to go with procedures, is what it amounts to. So you still have to have some procedures you use. But the bottom line is, if somebody updates the local database and develops and then doesn't check it in, something is going to error out at some point. And hopefully they'll figure it out and then start following proper check-in and check-out procedures. Question?
As per source control, does it only support
No, because it's a studio plugin that it's using. So it's whatever it is you want to use. So I'm going to say that with Git, I ran into a problem because the default Git configuration excludes files that have publish in the name. So it took me forever to figure out why my publish profile is not showing up in source control. So eventually I opened up that Git ignore and I found that. But outside of that, I did not see any problems with working with Git. It's just this unique one use case scenario. So I have project on both Git and TFS, and it works with either one. It doesn't really matter. So we talked about properties. So let's save that. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit is refactoring. There are a couple of refactorings, or a handful of refactorings that come with SSDT that make it easier to perform certain tasks. And in general, let's pick a table, and I'll show you what all is going on. Say I want to rename this column to artist name. So if I do this, and you would think that's a pretty logical step, and I'll just save it, and I'm going to publish, but I'm going to generate the script. And if I look to see what happens, it actually realized that I wanted to rename the column. In some cases, what you will find that it doesn't work quite right. So in this case, it did, but let me rename it here, for example. Save that and publish again. Whoops, didn't want to do that. Oh well. So here's my artist, columns, artist name 2. I didn't have any data in it, but if I look at refactor log, so for refactoring, you have all the changes that you make through refactoring, such as renames, they all go into a refactor log. So what you noticed is when I did it in the designer, when I changed it from name to artist name, it worked properly because my refactor log explains it. However, when I changed it in a script from artist name to artist name 2, it totally ignored it. So when I published it, it actually dropped the column and created a new one, which means you're going to lose all the data in the process. So what I found that if you're doing it in the designer, it's okay. If you're doing it in the script, then you have to use this refactor submenu. If you have ReSharper installed like I do, then you're going to see 2 refactor menus. You just have to find the right one. And so this one has a rename. And if I'm going to rename artist to artist name whatever, and I click OK, it actually gives me a nice little preview saying, are you trying to change the artist name from this to this? Are you sure you want to do that? And when I click apply, it added another refactoring. If I look at the database, let me refresh this, and I look at database 7 and tables and system tables, there is the secret table that is added by SSDT specifically to keep up with refactorings. So you want to make sure you don't run the same refactoring twice, because either it'll error out or it'll do something wrong. So they create the secret table called refactor log. Whoops, didn't want to do that. I just wanted to select from it. And it's going to give, like, each refactoring gets a unique ID. And if I look here, here's the ID that's going to be used. So your key becomes something that goes into refactor log, and that's how SSDT keeps up with all of your changes through this refactor log. So this is one refactoring. Now let's look at select artist refactoring. So how many DBAs do you know that like the star? Probably not that many. So if I click on refactor, another refactoring that I have is expand wildcards. Again, I get a very, very nice preview. And I click apply, and it did all that. And then now I can republish this database again, publish, and this time I'm going to, instead of generating the script, I'm going to publish straight from the tool. So when I work locally, that's what I do. I right click and I publish and I update my local database. In QA, we actually do it through MS Build. So we publish through MS Build. Now let's look at a different refactoring. So let me pull up the artist again, and I'm going to say, I really don't like this. I'm going to go back to just artist name, and I'm going to click save, and now I'm going to click publish. And all of a sudden I get the error. So let me see what it is that I did. And it immediately pointed out that what I just tried to do broke the store procedure. So what it cuts down on, SSDT, as part of the process, you catch this really annoying edge that otherwise you probably wouldn't know until it blows up. And let me change it back to, I don't remember what I named it to, artist name. So let me change it to this. I'll show you one more time. Let me publish it again. Now let me pull it back up, and now I do want to change it back to just name. So I'm going to right click on artist name, choose refactor, rename. I'm going to change it to simply just name. Click OK. See what just happened? It found my store procedure saying, hey, you're already using this, and then it says, do you want me to fix it for you? And I'm just going to click apply, and as part of that rename it actually fixed my store procedure. So it'll find whatever other objects you use in a specific column in, or a specific table in. Because you can apply the same refactoring to tables. Refactor, rename, and now I can rename the table exact same way. There are a couple of other refactorings that are available. One is move to schema. So if I use DBO and then DBA came in and says you need to break it down into modules, then you can move to different schemas through another refactoring. And lastly, it's kind of useless here, but in here I can say right click, refactor, fully qualified names, apply, and it will add the table and the schema and everything else, which is the best practice for database development, is to have all objects fully qualified. Runs faster, and by faster I mean instead of is by like 1/100th of 1 millisecond it'll be faster. But some people do care. I mean, if trying to if you have a really busy website and you're trying to shave off those few milliseconds, it will help a tiny bit. The point is, there are 4 types of refactoring that help you maintain your code and also keep you from making a lot of mistakes throughout that refactoring. And the only thing you have to remember is that refactor log also needs to be in source control. Otherwise, you're going to have some problems. Let's see, let me flip back, make sure I'm not forgetting stuff. Now the scripts. So anytime you deploy the schema, you typically deploy some seeded data. Like I've never worked on a project that didn't have some seeded data. So there is a facility for you to support that. So if I right click and add a new item, one of the options is going to be post-deployment and pre-deployment script, or you can just have plain vanilla script. So what post-deployment script does, and pre-deployment is the same way, it runs before or after, just like name applies, the schema changes are applied. However, they both run after the schema comparison run. So if you try to use the pre-deployment script to add a column in advance, then you're going to hit an exception. So it's important, tiny but important distinction, that both of them run after the schema comparison is done and a script is generated. It's simply injected into your script. So I've never had a need for pre-deployment yet, but post-deployment is something that we definitely use. And if you look at the properties of the script, you will see that the build action, unlike like stored procedures and other things, is a very specific build action called post-deploy. And so if you have a script that has to add data to a lot of tables, for example, insert into, and of course I get the IntelliSense, and I think I have just a name, values, I don't know, ACDC. So let me publish this again. And let me look at the artist table. So it added my artist. Let me publish one more time, see what happens. Refresh this. Now I have two with the same name. That's obviously not my intention. So there is one thing you have to remember about pre-deployment, post-deployment script. They are always run, which means you have to add some code to check for existence. And in this case, you want to say, if not exists, select star from artist where name is equal this, then do the insert. So now if I add this here, and I misspelled exists. There we go. Now if I publish this, hopefully it won't be added the third time around. So this is how you have to operate with the pre-post deployment script. You always have to add some code to see if you actually need to add the data. And if you want to see what happens if I publish, but I generate script, what you will see here that at the very end, my post-deployment script got injected as is. So whatever I had in my post-deployment script, it just got appended to the end of the deployment file. The overall deployment script. The other thing you have to remember is that if you have maybe 50 tables you have to populate, that you imagine that this post-deployment script is going to have 10,000 lines in it before too long, plus you have multiple people editing the same file. And that's going to be quite irritating. So instead of doing that, what I want to do is add simple user script, and it needs to be in build. I'm just going to leave it as script 1. Now what I can do is move this code from here to my script 1, and for my post-deployment script, I can simply say this very strange syntax that you have to use is :R and then path to the script. And it says that I have errors, but hopefully I don't. We'll find out in a minute. So if I publish this, error list, I do have some kind of problem. It's a script 1. Let's try to delete that. Although this is correct, or it should be correct. Let's try it again. This is the right syntax, but for some reason it's now complaining. Well, it even says show here how to do it, so I'm not sure what broke in my studio. Oh, I know what it is. What I did, I marked it as build action build, whereas I want the build action to be actually none. So let's try this. Publish, and if I'm gonna look at view script, you see that exact same script got injected, except the content of my other script file got injected into it. So all other script files you just have to mark as not in build instead of build, which is the mistake that I made. Otherwise, you're going to get some compilation errors because it expects a certain syntax for the script file, like a table creation script. One interesting part about it, which you don't want to change, but if I open with editor, the script that is created, it's always a create script. And SSDT on its own figures out how to create an alter script. So it never actually drops and recreates the table. It creates an alter script, but the actual object scripts, they're always create scripts. So we looked at the pre-post deployment. For the most part, we're getting close to be done. So I created this database from an existing database. So there is a whole other variety of tools that I did not show you available under SQL menu. So this plain SQL menu, that's what SSDT adds. And one of those things is the schema comparison. So prior to this, what you had to use is typically a Redgate tool or something like that, and that's because Microsoft didn't have a tool like that. And your source could be a number of things. So in my case, I can just make it this project I'm on, database 7. And now the target is going to be my original database that I use to script it out. And I click OK, and then I can click compare. So I made some changes from the original database. I think I renamed a few things, I created a few things. So anyway, after it ran through, it actually noticed that I created a procedure. So let's do this, because I wanted to illustrate a little bit more. So let me refactor this column. Refactor, rename. I'm going to change it to artist name. Let's try this. I'm going to rename it. I'm going to apply rename here. I'm going to publish. And then I'm going to run compare one more time. Schema compare. And we're going to do it again. So from a source is going to be my project. And a destination is going to be my original database. And now I can run a compare. And now the table changed. And that's what I wanted to show you. It actually has a very nice highlighting going on saying that this was the change that I wanted to do. So now from this comparison window, I can do actually a couple of things. One of those, I can choose to update the database. So I can update the target. I don't want to do that, but I could simply compare two databases and bring them in line by update target. And where DBH work is really useful. So he or she can have like production and a QA database, and they're ready to push. You run a comparison, and then you click on this script button, and it'll create a script with all the changes. So it's similar to the flow that you would have straight from the project, but you do have some advanced functionality in case you want to run a straight up comparison. And you can actually walk through from change to change, and you have some other options like filtering, and you have some settings. Settings window, if you remember, looks exactly like the options on the published profile. So you see exact same pretty much changes. So you can tell it to ignore maybe logins or user rights or whatever else on the project. So schema comparison is pretty neat. The other thing that you have under SQL menu is the data compare. And in this case, I have my source database, which would be my database 7, and my original database. And then I can do the comparison. and I don't have to create like comparison with all the tables. And I can just say, I just want to do just the artist table. And in this case, it actually compared the rows, and it tells me, this unique IDs or primary keys exist in here. You have some identical with the same primary keys, and then you also have differences. Well, I don't, but you can also spot the difference. So what you see here is some of the very, very useful functionality that was prior to this in tools like Redgate or Quest made its way into Microsoft product, where you can use it straight out of the box. And as far as pricing is concerned, it's free if you have a valid SQL Server license that's for like DBA, or if you have valid Visual Studio license, then it's free as well. So the only time you have to pay for it if you don't have either one, which is, as far as Microsoft developers go, that's probably not even a valid use case. You will likely have one or the other. And SQL Server is really the online object explorer that I was talking about. So let me flip back to slides and see, make sure I haven't missed anything. So we talked about that. So this is the highlights of all the features. I didn't really show you one thing, and that's SQL Azure. So if I look at my project properties, as far as project settings go, I can set the target platform. So I know we have a project that runs on Azure, and when it comes to all these different types of SQL Server, not only you can select what your defined target is, but it can do some compile time check. For example, if I add an albums, and in here I flip to properties, and there is a description here, title, and let's see if I have, there is no description here, but I can add MS description. So MS description is something that SQL Azure does not support. Or another good example would be creating primary key. Is it non-cluster? There we go. So this is a valid for the most part syntax, but however, SQL Azure requires every table to have cluster primary key. And it actually spotted out, and it gives you exact error that says clustered indices are required for this specific version of SQL Server. In my case, it's Azure. So this target for your project that you set up actually does compile time checking. And this is just one of the examples. SQL Azure, for example, also doesn't support MS description, so you cannot add descriptions onto your object custom descriptions. You will get similar error on that as well. It just says this version of SQL Server doesn't support it. Same is going to apply if you use maybe DB geography type or geography type and your target is 2005. You'll get an identical error on that. And so we talked about most things. I didn't talk about simplified scripts, but I showed you one of the tables, and you see that the columns and then the indices and foreign keys are all in one file. And so that to me is like a huge improvement over DataDude, because everything related to a specific table is all in one file. You can look at the history and you see what changes occurred without having to hunt through like 12 or more files to see what changes occurred. So that was really a big deal. IntelliSense, we really talked about pretty much everything on this list. We talked about importing databases and deploying changes. We really talked about everything I wanted to touch. So to conclude, if you have any questions, you can email me. My email address is also on my blog. I will post the slides. There is no sample project for me to post really, because you can create your own in 2 clicks, saying create new project and import the database, and there is your own personal project. But I will post the slides on the blog. So to conclude, In the company I'm working for right now, we used one giant SQL script that everybody has to maintain, and people continuously fight for changes, and continuously there are problems, typos, mismatches, all kind of issues. We switched one of the teams to use SSDT, and the number of errors in scripts just went way down. And that's because the tooling really fits what developers are doing. That's, to me, is a number one plus. It really works with you. You don't have to fight it. It works with you. Changes are easy for both developers who like nice UI and those who like scripts. They can pick whatever it is they want to do. All the typical refactorings are supported. Publishing is also super easy. The build integration is really well as well. I'm not sure if I mentioned, but all the publish updates are transactions. So if something bad happens, there is no data loss. The transactions are just rolled back. No harm done to your target database. That's really all I want to talk about. I want to leave a couple of minutes for any questions, but I think I covered everything I wanted to. Questions? Yes.
I have a TFS question.
Sure.
So if I have separate projects, like one for my development, one for my separate branches for production and development, let's say, can I use TFS to merge from development to production, and will it
Certainly.
recognize all that?
It'll recognize everything, and primarily I didn't open the SQL proj file in a notepad, but you will see the structure is almost identical to any project. You'll simply list all the SQL files, all of your scripts in it, so you can merge the project. It'll spell out what the differences are. You can also merge each individual script, because they're plain text files, they're not binary files, which means any source control comparison tool will work without a hitch. One thing I did notice, and I'm not really sure why, but sometimes the projects don't merge quite right. And what I mean by that, it forces you to do manual merge, in my opinion, more often than it should. And I really can't find rhyme or reason why, but you can see that it rearranges the scripts a little bit. Like you make a change to one table or you add a table, and you see that it rearranged other tables. And I haven't figured out why it does that, but it messes with the merge. And you have to oftentimes, I have to do manual merge, but typically it's just, I want to include both sides. It's not like a complicated merge. You just say, just include both sides on the comparison tool, and it works. So yeah, coming back to your questions, works without a hitch. Any kind of branches, merging. Plain text files, they make everybody's job a lot easier. So to me, that's really great that that's all they use, even though the designer sits on top of them and make it look fancier than what it really is. Any other questions?
Is there an easy way if you don't have an internal production database, but you have a bunch of client databases that may be on different versions with different schemas, is there a good way to do that?
You can use the schema comparison if you want to. And one of the schema comparison options is to compare the real database with the project. So if you have a project in source control, and it comes back to really, it's more of a source control question. So what we do, we branch for each release. So whenever we do release, we create a branch. And for next release, we'll create the next release branch. So as long as you get latest of that branch, then you can compare that source control, that project and source control with the client database and see what the differences are. And then you can redeploy the change. So you can certainly do it, but this is more like a source control question, I think, than the actual how to use the tool, because you use the tool the exact same way. And so three options that you have, you can compare with a project, with a database, or with a DECPAC file, which is the Microsoft format for publishing databases. And DECPAC file seem to be their standard, but I know we don't use the DECPAC file, but you could. And then you can compare DECPAC file with a database as well.
We build and install and send out the install, and the install is, I mean, these are on-site. We have no attachment to those data sets.
Yeah. So you have some options. You can use DeckPack as a deployment model. If you read about DeckPack, you'll see it works with the executable tool, so you can launch an exe with the DeckPack file, and it'll do the deployment for you. So you can publish those, or you can publish the script. So if you know what their version looks like, or you don't.
Varying versions, as I said, they would be like taken from where they were up to what's now, what's current.
I think you almost have to get their database in there, because this works by comparison. So it has to compare something with something else to generate the script
Through this tool.
from here. So if you get their database into your development shop, then you can obviously do that. However, if they alter the schema, I'm not really sure how you could do it. If you don't know how they altered it, and then I think you have numerous problems, because they may even have conflicting changes with yours.
Now, they're not allowed to change.
Or they're not.
If they have, you did the version thing.
Yeah, if you have
Just
branches.
create one of the version they have, and then compare the latest to it to get your changes.
I think the key is you have to branch when you ship. So if you adopt that model, branch when you ship, then you always have that in source control. Without that, it's going to be very hard. And that's what we adopted. We used to label, but branching, I think, is much easier than labeling. You can get as of a label, but we use branching, I think, exclusively now. So anytime we ship, there is a branch to match. And I think if you do that, you'll find you won't be fighting with it as much. So in those specific use cases, I don't know how the SSDT is going to help you very much, unfortunately. Any other questions? I'll stick around outside, but I want to clear the podium for the next person. Appreciate everybody's time. Enjoy your very last session of the DevLink. Thanks for your attention.